Well, it was a night of celebration. Jesus and his disciples were sharing the Passover together. They were remembering God's deliverance in the past, and they were looking forward to his deliverance in the future. But then the mood changed. It was a dark night as they went out into the garden. And as they went to the garden, they went out there to pray. Jesus left the majority of disciples in one place. He took Peter, James, and John with him a little further. And then he told them, wait here and pray. I'm going to go over there and pray. And Jesus prayed and agonized in prayer. Well, when he was finished praying, a mob came into the garden. They came to arrest him. Of course, Jesus knew this was happening. And he said, it's time, let's go. And as you read these passages of Jesus' arrest, you see that Jesus is clearly in control of the situation. As they come to arrest him, this mob with their torches and with their swords and clubs, Jesus asks, who are you looking for? And they say, we're looking for Jesus. And he says, I am he, or I am. And the crowd steps back, falls back. Who has the power in this situation? Who's in control? Jesus. And then Judas steps forward and kisses Jesus, because he had told them, the one that I kissed, that's Jesus. That's who you need to arrest. And so he betrays Jesus with a kiss. They come to arrest Jesus, and Jesus says, that's fine, you can take me, but let these go. And the disciples, they scatter. And Jesus is left there alone. Well, the scene changes. They're now at the home of the high priest. And there at the home of the high priest, Jesus is on trial. They're trying to figure out some way to charge him. And they are bringing people in to make testimony against him. But they can't make any charges stick because all their stories don't fit. They're different. It's because they're not true. But they're trying to come up with something. Finally, they ask the question, are you the Messiah, the Christ? Are you the Son of God? And Jesus says, you said so. And he says, in the future, you're going to see me at the right hand of God, the right hand of glory. And at that point, they say, that's enough. We've heard enough. And they accuse him of blaspheming because he's made himself equal with God. Well, they take him to Pilate. And they ask Pilate to crucify him. Pilate says, why don't you take him and deal with him yourself? This is just a matter of your own law. And they said, we can't because we're not allowed to crucify someone. At this point, Pilate understands what they want. They want him dead. And so then Jesus is put on trial again. And Pilate asks questions. And Pilate comes to the point of finding Jesus innocent. He says, I don't find anything that he's guilty of. He's done nothing wrong, nothing deserving death. So Pilate washes his hands of the situation as if to say, this isn't my fault. But then, to please the Jews, he condemns Jesus, an innocent man, to death. But you know what? This only happened, really, because God allowed it. I mean, this happened because this was God's plan. Jesus was to come to die for our sin so that we could be forgiven and made right with God. So because it is in God's plan, Pilate condemns this innocent Jesus. So Pilate flogs him or has him whipped severely, and he sends him away to be killed. He's led to a hill outside of the city, a hill, and he'll be crucified in a public space where everyone who's walking by can see. You see, they're making an example of these people that they crucify. You don't want to cross Rome. But he's hung on the hill where everyone can see it. And to add insult to injury, they make these condemned men carry the cross to the place where they will be tortured to death. So they have to carry the cross to the place where they'll be hung on it. But they get to that place, and Jesus is laid down on this cross, laid down on that rough wood after being beaten and whipped. He is laid down on that rough wood of the cross. He has his arms stretched out, and he's nailed to that cross. He has his feet put on there and nailed to that cross. Then they pick the cross up and drop it in the hole. Drop it in place. And he hung there. They were hung there basically to suffocate to death. You see, because when you're hanging on that cross, you can breathe in, but you can't breathe out. So you have to push up to breathe out if you have the strength to do it. And it's in those times when Jesus pushed up that he shouted out several statements, made several statements, like Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Or, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, there are a few unusual things that happened while Jesus was hanging on that cross. In the middle of the day, the sky went dark. When the sun is usually shining bright, it went dark for 3 hours. And when Jesus died, we're told that the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place was torn in two from top to bottom. God displaying the fact that he has opened the way to come to him through Jesus. And another thing unusual is that when Jesus died, just before he died, he cried out with a loud voice. Normally when people died of crucifixion, they were very weak when they died. But Jesus cried out with a loud voice. He said, "It is finished." He had done what he had come to accomplish. He died to pay the price for our sin so we could be forgiven and made right with God. And then Jesus said, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he died. The Son of God, hanging on that cross. As a centurion, when he saw how Jesus died, he said, truly, this is the Son of God. So Jesus, the Son of God, is hanging on that cross in the open air, dead, like a common criminal. Although he did nothing wrong. Well, then a brave man, a Jewish man by the name of Joseph, asked for Jesus' body so that he could take it down and give Jesus a proper burial. Pilate gave him permission. He takes the body down, he wraps it in cloth, and Joseph puts it in his own tomb. It was brand new, never been used. He closed this tomb, puts a heavy rock over the entrance, and leaves. And as far as he and the other followers of Jesus can tell, that's the end. That's it. It's over. Jesus is dead. But Sunday morning changes everything. They learn that it is not over. The ladies go to the tomb to mourn and to put spices around the body, spices that can counter the stink of a rotting body. But when they get there, they find that the tomb is open and the body is gone. Jesus isn't there. They learn that Jesus is alive. And over the next 40 days, Jesus appears to the disciples individually and in groups, and he appears to them, and he even appeared to a group of over 500 people at one time. And he hung out with them, and he taught them what they needed to know. Now, this is a true story, comes straight out of history. Of course, we read it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the four Gospels. But when people hear this story, when they hear this account of Jesus' resurrection, both today and for the last 2,000 years, different people react differently to it. Some people know that it's true. They believe it, and this awesome truth brings joy, and we celebrate this truth, Jesus' resurrection. But some people flat out reject it. They don't believe it, and they refuse to even consider it. And others are skeptical. They're just not sure. After all, people don't just rise from the dead. And you know what? That's true. People don't just rise from the dead. But Jesus is unique. Jesus is the Son of God. And Jesus lived a sinless life. He didn't deserve to die. But he did it to take our judgment for our sin that we deserve, the judgment we deserve for our sin, so that we could be forgiven. And then God raised him from the dead and showed that he didn't deserve that death. He raised Jesus from the dead. And like I said, people have different reactions to the resurrection. Today, we're going to look at a few of the earliest reactions to that news that Jesus had raised from the dead. And we're going to see how they responded. And I want to ask you the question this morning. Do you believe? So first, we're going to look at the Jewish religious leaders. These are people who wanted Jesus dead. They asked Pilate to crucify him. They didn't like Jesus. They didn't, because Jesus didn't fit into their system. He didn't fit their view of life. And Jesus challenged them on their views and on the way they lived, because they weren't following God's ways. They were following their own man-made religious practices. So they didn't like Jesus or believe in Jesus, and they weren't about to start now, even though he had raised from the dead. They weren't about to start believing in him no matter what happened. So let's read in Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 62. It says, the next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember how that impostor, speaking of Jesus, said while he was still alive, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, you have a guard of soldiers. Go make it as secure as you can. So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. So this is interesting. They didn't believe in Jesus, but they heard what he said. He had said that he would raise from the dead. The ironic thing is that even his followers, even the disciples, they didn't understand that. They heard Jesus say it, but it didn't make any sense to them when he said it. And they didn't understand it. They weren't expecting it. But the religious leaders, they were afraid that the disciples would come and steal Jesus' body and spread a lie that he had risen and misled many people. And so they want to secure the tomb. So Pilate says, go and do it. So they do. They secure the tomb. They set up soldiers to guard it. So no one could get close to the tomb. In fact, they wouldn't even try because there's soldiers there. But just in case, they also seal the door of the tomb, the stone. They probably poured wax on the stone so that if it was moved, the seal would break and it would be obvious. So they poured the wax on there. There's probably some kind of official stamp on that as well. But if the stone was moved, it would be clear that someone had moved it, had opened the tomb. But then what happened? Well, Jesus raised from the dead. That stone in front of the tomb was rolled open. And the guards were scared to death. But then think about this. If you were a soldier given the responsibility to guard a sealed tomb, and this happened, it suddenly opened up, what would you do? Well, let's keep reading. Matthew 28, beginning in verse 11. Still talking about these guards. He says, while they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Now notice it says some of the soldiers went and talked to him, the leaders, about what happened. Why only some? Well, maybe the others are still too scared. Don't know, but some of them went and talked to him about it. But notice the leaders' reaction to the news. They are so opposed to Jesus that when they hear what actually happened, they immediately start a cover-up. They come up with a plan to hide the truth, and they pay the guards, and it must have been a good amount of money. But they pay those guards to lie. They bribe them. And they tell them, just say that you fell asleep, and while you were asleep, the disciples came and stole the body. And they promised to smooth out any issues that might come up with the governor. And this may have probably involved another bribe. But why? I mean, why would they have to pay this good amount of money? Why would they have to convince them not to tell the story? Well, because this was a serious issue. Soldiers who were found sleeping while on duty were put to death, normally. And so the religious leaders had to convince them to tell this lie, even a lie that would put their lives in danger. But they did it, and the lie passed around amongst the Jews, and many fell for it. But if you think about it, there are some real problems with this story, with this lie that they told. First of all, what kind of condition were the disciples in at this time? They were scared, all right? They were afraid. They had scattered and they were hiding. At this point in time, they're not a really confident group of guys, all right? They're not up to carrying out a grave robbery. But even on top of that, people knew what happened to soldiers who fell asleep while on guard duty. And they would wonder, or should wonder, why would they admit that they were asleep? And on top of that, why are they still walking around free and alive if they fell asleep while they were on duty? And the third question, if the guards were asleep, how would they know what happened?
Good point.
I mean, they're telling everyone, oh, we are asleep. The disciples came. How do you know? You were asleep. But sometimes people just believe what they want to believe. And some people just want to believe what fits their own way of thinking. And so they'll believe the lie and refuse to believe in Jesus. Well, that was the religious leaders who didn't like Jesus. What about his own followers? The people who loved him and believed the things he taught. How did they react to the news of the empty tomb? We're going to actually see 4 different reactions here from followers of Jesus. First, we're going to talk about the disciples, specifically Peter and John. So turn to the right to the book of Luke, the end of the book of Luke, chapter 24. So 2 books to the right, chapter 24, starting in verse 10. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, the other women with them, who told these things to the apostles. So they had gone to the tomb and found it empty, and they tell the apostles, but these words seemed to them an idle tale. They did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb, and stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. So Jesus had told his disciples that he would rise from the dead. But now they're told that the tomb is empty, and an angel said that Jesus had raised, just like he said. And when the women tell the disciples this, what's their reaction? They said it sounds like an idle tale. In other words, it sounds like nonsense, like a crazy story, like a fairy tale. Why? Again, because people don't just rise from the dead. And so their initial reaction is disbelief. But Peter has to go see it himself. And so he runs to the tomb, and he gets there and he sees the empty tomb, and he sees the graves closed, and he goes home, but it says here that he's marveling. He's wondering. He's confused. He doesn't know what to think of it. But his initial reaction, disbelief. Well, John also had to go see, and if you turn to John, so one more book to the right, the book of John, chapter 20. We'll start in verse 8. Chapter 20, verse 8 says, then the other disciple, speaking of John, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. Did you notice his reaction? Belief. So he didn't understand it all, but he saw the evidence and believed. Well, let's talk about Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, she was the first to get to the tomb and the first to see Jesus alive. We find this in John chapter 20. Look at verse 10. Verse 10 says, then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, woman, why are you weeping? She said to them, they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. So she found the tomb empty. It was empty. Found the tomb open, and it was empty. And she is completely distraught by this. She is weeping. And she takes a look inside the tomb, and there's a couple angels there. Now, this might be significant if there's some angels sitting there, but maybe she doesn't realize they're angels. But when she answers their question, they say, why are you weeping? When she answers their questions, we find out what she's thinking. She's not thinking that Jesus has been raised, but that someone has moved the body. Let's keep reading, verse 14. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. And so now she's talking with Jesus without knowing who it is, probably because she's been crying so hard that she can't recognize him through her tears. But when Jesus says her name, she immediately knows who it is. She knows it's Jesus. He's alive. Verse 17. Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord, and that he had said these things to her. So Jesus sends her to tell the disciples, and so she does. She's seen Jesus and she believes that he is alive. But she clearly wasn't expecting Jesus to be alive. After all, she saw him die. He was dead. So in her mind, there had to be another explanation for this empty tomb. She didn't believe he was alive, but then she saw him and she knew it. There was absolute proof. What about the disciples again? This time they're in a room without Thomas. At least we find that out later. But chapter 20, verse 19. On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. So the disciples are together that night, except we'll find out that Thomas isn't with them. But they're still scared and confused. They're scared because Jesus was arrested and killed. And they were with him. They're associated with him. They're his group. And so they could have been arrested as well. And they may still be targets. And they're confused because they know Jesus had been sent from God. They knew that Jesus would change things in this world. But then Jesus was put to death. Now, he had said this that would happen, but again, it didn't make any sense to them when he said it. But now they know that the tomb is empty, and Mary has said that she's seen him, and he's alive. So they don't know what to think, but they're gathered together, and they're waiting. The doors are locked, but suddenly, Jesus is right there with them in the room. And he shows them the scars in his hands and his side to prove to them that he is really who he is. And he talks with them. And now they believe. But Thomas hadn't been with them. And when they told Thomas, he didn't believe. Look at chapter 20, verse 24. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the marks of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put your hand out and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." So it's a week later in the same situation. They're locked inside together. And Jesus comes and he goes right to Thomas. He knows what Thomas said. He knows that Thomas didn't believe. He knows that Thomas said that he would have to touch those scars. And so he says, "Here it is. Come check it out, Thomas." But when Jesus talks to Thomas, Thomas immediately believes. And we know it from what he says. And it shows that he believes even more than just the facts or the fact that Jesus is alive. He understands the significance of the fact that Jesus is alive. He says to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." He understands that Jesus is Lord. He understands that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is God. Now, this is an awesome faith statement. Thomas believes. But notice the way Jesus challenges Thomas here. He said, don't disbelieve, but believe. He's saying, move on from your faithless position. Don't hold on to your faithless way of thinking. Change your way of thinking. Stop your disbelief and believe. Believe. Well, then there's one other group, and that is those who don't see but believe. You see, what we see in these first followers of Jesus is many of them believed in Jesus, but most of them didn't believe until they saw him alive. Today, we don't have the ability to physically see Jesus, but we still need to believe in him. But look what Jesus said in John 20, verse 29. Jesus said, he's still speaking to Thomas, he says, have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. He's talking about people like you and I, who we believe even without seeing. But this is not just some blind faith that we have. I mean, look what John says next in verse 30 and 31. It says, now, Jesus did many other signs or miracles in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You see, we believe in Jesus based on the truth. They were eyewitnesses of Jesus' death and resurrection. And they passed on the evidence to us, the things that they saw. They heard his teaching firsthand. They saw his miracles firsthand. Miracles like starting with the water being turned into wine. Miracles like healing the sick, the blind receiving their sight, people who were crippled being made able to walk, even some raised from the dead. They saw Jesus do these things. And then they saw Jesus dead. And then they saw him alive. And John says that they wrote it down. They wrote all of this down for us so that we could know the truth, so that we could believe, and by believing, have life. But what does he mean by have life? Let me explain. You see, we were created to have a relationship with God. That's how life was meant to be, lived in relationship with him. We were created to live in relationship with God, but our sin broke that relationship with God. Our sin cut us off from God. Our sin, because of our sin, we deserve judgment. We deserve punishment because we disobeyed God, we opposed God, and we did things our own way. But God sent Jesus to die on the cross. Jesus lived a sinless life. He didn't deserve punishment. He didn't deserve judgment. But he took our sin upon himself, and he took the judgment for our sin. He died in our place so that we could be forgiven. And God's word says if you believe in Jesus, you will be saved. If you trust that his death on the cross paid the price for your sin, you'll be saved. You'll be forgiven of your sin. You will be made a child of God. You can live in relationship with him now and live with him for eternity. Jesus died so we could be saved from judgment. And Jesus rose so we could live with him forever. Do you believe? God's word says, believe on the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved. Today is a day of celebration because Jesus is alive. And as believers in Jesus, we know that he died, that he was buried, and on the third day rose again. And because he's alive, we have life. Because he's alive, we have been reconciled to God, brought back into a right relationship with God. And you know what? Death could not hold him. Death could not hold Jesus. But that means for those of us who have believed in Jesus, those of us who are following Jesus, that means death can't hold us either. Because we belong to Jesus. We're with him. We belong to the risen Savior. This is good news. We are saved from judgment. We have eternal life. We live in a right relationship with God, and we have hope because Jesus is alive.